The 28th of April 2018 edition of This Week in Economics, brought to you by Cranston Analytics. And Numbers Man is here as usual, talking about the week's developments in the economic sphere in macroeconomics. Very interesting there. We have a lot of PMIs from the market people. We'll look at the global economy from various nations, from France, from China, from Kenya, from Ghana, and various other Germany, the UK, various other nations. So we get a little bit of picture of where global trade is in the current phase of capitalism, we'll call it, for another term. We fall back on Dr. Pitte, Thomas Pitte, and his sentinel work on capitalism. But it's a very interesting situation here. We'll talk a little about from Bloomberg on Basic, where it is, and where one particular person thinks it will end up. One of the more important takeaways here when we look at, say, Germany and the effects of these tariffs, the Chancellor Merkel and the French President Macron were in Washington last week, or this week actually. And all of their speechifying, as we'll use that term, an old-fashioned term, did not amount to very much. Germany is the fifth largest producer of steel, and the 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum, aluminium, whichever one you want to call it. I think it's at 10 or 10%. Nonetheless, that affects many of these nations. So effectively what they have to do is block out the U.S. As far as any type of negotiation, that in itself is very, very problematic for some, depending on their economy. Now, Germany, the largest economy in the EU, is in a little different position. But they are a things economy, in other words, a manufacturing-based economy that imports their goods to the world. I noticed Field Marshal the leader of Democratic Republic of Korea, or North Korea, he had a limousine, had the Mercedes on it. Not unusual. You'll see that logo around the world, and you see it now. Trucks in the U.S., more and more of those. But perhaps you will see less. Now, in some of these markets, you do have American cars or American car companies. Ford in Italy, primarily there. And I used to have an old Ford, a UK Ford. Anyway, nonetheless, around there. But you do see a lot of German cars here in, you see Mercedes, you see Audi and BMW. But those are pretty much looked at as upward mobility mobiles that cater to the middle class, or actually upper middle class patrons. So does it affect the quote-unquote common man, common woman? No. That is more to the Japanese and Korean car companies, Nissan, etc., but they have plants in the U.S., so that is a little different situation. So does Mercedes. I'm not sure if Audi does or not, but many of those plants are there. And the problem with the whole tariff situation is that on steel, that will expand steel makers. If you look at U.S. Steel, some of the largest steel makers. But the ones that use what's called roll steel or ready steel for their products, smaller plants, usually from 100 to maybe 400 or 500 workers or less, that will make their products cost more. And some suppliers will buy from them, some suppliers will not. So it will already depend on what's going on. Some suppliers have already factored in the new tariffs into their costs. In other words, they've upped the costs, so that will be passed on to whomever, the consumer. And the consumer, will go to GDP here in a minute. The consumer in the U.S. is in a very transitional state, we'll call it, and perhaps a tenuous state, in that 70% of the economic output of the U.S. is based on quote-unquote consumer spending. And as many people have seen from their reading or hearing, whichever one comes first, that the retail brick and mortar, in other words, stores in shopping malls, etc., are in trouble and closing, or they are in a bankruptcy or liquidating of their wares after this historic holiday season. That would be a Q4, and that's one of the things we look at. The pennies, the Sears operation, liquidating stores right and left. Many were just open to serve the holiday season, and prices were down, and after that they had liquidation and the end of that. In other words, their in-run was usually in the last of January or February, and some have lasted into May. I noticed a number of the stores on the BombBomb, I think it is, a retailer that has a number of different types of outlets, is now liquidating of their stores. So we see this appearing, and then we also see corporate adjustments, redundancies, or layoffs are being made. Not large layoffs, but nonetheless some layoffs. Now those small 500, 1,000 worker layoffs are about the number of jobs, I should say, that are being created by the so-called tariffs. They have their limit. And again, that is an old school, you don't like to use those terms on the economics report, but it is an aged type of remedy being used. You don't see it used as much in a modern capitalist globalized economy, but nonetheless it is being brought out. And also the idea of the tax cut. What has happened with the tax cut? One columnist pointed out that since people no longer get the quote-unquote pay stubs or whatever, it's all done electronically, they are not seeing the $40 to $50 or $60 additional take home. In other words, it's around $100 or less than $100, depending obviously on the individual. They don't see it. But if you factor in inflation, and also if you have increase in crude oil for those people, especially people in rural areas in the West that drive longer distances, they will feel the impact. These are usually contracts of 3 months out, but they will start to feel the impact if, in fact, crude goes to around $100, about $75. We'll get to that in a minute here. But let's go to the gross domestic product. This is the latest readings. Now, this is the advanced estimate. You really don't have to put as much stock into it. The next report will be out on the 30th of May, 2018. But nonetheless, GDP at an annual rate of 2.3% in Q1. And the fourth quarter real GDP increased to 2.9%. But that's not sustainable. The Bureau emphasized the first quarter estimate released is based upon source data, no doubt about that. The increase in real GDP in the first quarter reflects positive contributions from non-residential fixed investment, personal consumption expenditures, that is PCE, exports, private inventory investment, federal spending, and state and local government spending. Imports were subtracted in the calculation of GDP. Deceleration in real GDP growth in the first quarter reflects deceleration in PCE, residential fixed investments, exports, state and local. These movements were partially offset by upturns in private inventory investment. Imports were subtracted there. The current dollar GDP increased at 4.3%, or $211.2 billion in Q1, to a level of 18,970,000,000. There, in the fourth quarter, current GDP increased 5.3%, or $253.5 billion. The price index for gross domestic purchases increased 2.8% in Q1, compared with an increase of 2.5% in Q4. The PCE price index increased 2.7%, the same increase in Q4. The PCE index increased 2.5% compared with 2.1%. Now, this is excluding energy and food prices. Personal income. Current dollar personal income increased $182.1 billion in Q1, compared with an increase of $186.4 billion in Q4. Deceleration in personal interest income, rental income, and non-farm properties incomes were largely offset by acceleration in wages, salaries, and in government social benefits. Personal current tax decreased $40.1 billion in Q1, compared with an increase of $50.1 in Q4. Disposable personal income, something we look at very, very closely here, $222.1 billion, or 6.2% in the first quarter, compared with an increase of $136.3 billion, or 3.8% in Q4. Real disposable personal income increased 3.4%, compared with an increase of 1.1%. Personal savings was at $462.1 billion in Q1, compared with $379.8 billion in Q4. Personal savings rate. Personal savings as a percentage of disposable income was at 3.1% in Q1, compared with 2.6% in Q4. The 2007 Tax Cut and Jobs Act, including provisions that impact personal income statistics in the national income and product accounts. And this is just on some updates that are coming now. Information on assumptions used in unavailable source data. We won't get really into that. This is just definitions here, updates with GDP. And I believe we went through GDP, and when did we get GDI in this one? I'm not certain. I guess we did not, because this is just the advanced estimate, so we don't have as much here as we would prefer to have. We'll go to Bloomberg here. The Fed may lean towards 4 rate increases in 2008 after data from wages here. Wages gained probably a nudge faster towards raising interest rates a total of 4 times this year rather than 3. 4, yeah, we've always looked at seeing at least for this time around. At the margins of this pushes in that direction, that is Michael Fedro. He's the chief economist at J.P. Morgan Chase. After news that the first quarter employee compensation now rose 2.7% over the past 12 months. A lot of agreements out there at 2% or at 1%. There, the Federal Open Market Committee was pretty much evenly split on 3 or 4 times there. When you talk about rate increases, you have to factor in where the economy is actually going. Now, you keep rates down when the economy is actually growing at a very slow pace, but when it picks up, it is many times prudent, for instance, if you're going with, say, 3 rate increases, to throw in a 4th, because you can always correct that in your next the next year. Another data point suggesting that 4 rates rather than 3 is the 3.2% annualized increase in a personal consumption expenditure index, excluding of food. Now, that is one of the things. The Fed's target rate of 2% inflation, and how they will actually deal with it. Now, this is from CNBC. Reading of GDP up, 2.3% versus 2% growth expected. The economy slowed in the first quarter as consumer spending grew at the weakest pace in 5 years, but the setback is likely temporary against a backdrop of a tightening labor market and large fiscal stimulus. A very unusual situation here where you come in with fiscal stimulus in an economy of this nature. The economy grew at 2.9% in Q4. Economists by Reuters had forecast a 2% rate in January to March. It grew a little bit faster than that. The fourth quarter growth pace, however, probably not the true reflection of the economy, despite a weakness in consumer spending. First quarter leads to be sluggish because of seasonal quirks. No doubt about that. There are seasonal quirks out there. The labor market is near what they call now, it's termed full employment. Both business and consumer confidence are strong. That is sort of a mixed situation. When we get to the PMIs, we'll talk more about this, but economists expect growth will accelerate in Q2 as households start to feel the impact of the $1.5 trillion income tax package in their paychecks. The tax cuts went into effect, of course, in January. Lower corporate and individual tax rates, as well increase in government spending will likely lift the annual economic growth to the administration's 3% target. I don't share that view at this point in time. Now, I'm not saying that obviously it could not occur. They said, but again, are likely to start the Federal Reserve officials. Yeah, the central bank raised interest rates last month, a nod to strong market in the economy and the forecast for at least 2 rates this year. Minutes of the March 21st and 20th and 21st published earlier this month shows policymakers expected the first quarter softness would be transitory. Growth in consumer spending, which accounts for more than 2/3, break to 1.1% in Q1. That's the slowest pace since the second quarter of 2013, followed by the fourth quarter's robust 4% growth. Consumer spending in the last quarter was undercut by a decline in purchases of motor vehicles, clothes, footwear, as well as a slowdown in food and beverage outlay. This likely reflects to delays in the tax refunds. Now, see, this is sort of a more of an artificial thing. The survey, the tax cuts did not reflect on workers' paychecks until late in the first quarter. Income at the disposal of households increased at 3.4% rate in Q1, accelerating from 1.4% in Q4. Now, we did look at the savings rate. Now, that in itself is good for overall economy. Business spending on equipment slowed to a 4.7% rate in January to March quarter, after double growth in the second half of 2017. That was anticipating the tax cut. Cooling and equipment investment partially reflects a fading boost from a recovery in commodity prices. Economists expect marginal impact on business spending on equipment from rising interest rates and more expensive raw materials. Government spending grew at 1.2%, slowing from the fourth quarter 3%. Price spending is expected to accelerate in the second quarter after Congress approves more government spending. Trade added 0.20% to GDP growth as rising exports offset an increase in imports that was driven by royalties and broadcast license fees related to the Winter Olympics. A weak dollar and strengthening global economy are boosting exports. With consumer spending slowing, inventories increased at $33.1 billion in the first quarter, up from $5.6 billion pace in the prior period. Inventory contributions at 0.43% to GDP growth after subtracting 0.53 in the fourth quarter. So this is basically what you are seeing out here, and it's a kind of a mixed bag. Now, what is missing in the scenario is what could possibly happen in the future. Now, this is Brexit here. This is again from Bloomberg. Barry Ritholtz is a columnist. Anyway, his Brexit failures looks more likely every day as his surmise, and we'll say soon. Excuse me. Soon after the referendum in which Brits unwisely voted to leave the EU, I suggested there would be a 33% chance that Brexit wouldn't occur. Now I moved that to to 75% with every passing day of incompetence shown by the Tory government. With the disclosure out of the way, I would like to explain the thinking. From the beginning, I've been skeptical of a full Brexit, in other words, separation occurring. The concept was simply so foolish and self-destructive that reasonable expectations was cooler heads would prevail. May's government making a bad situation even worse. There's several ways this can be done. Probably will fall apart in order and likelihood doing nothing. Snap parliamentary elections leading to May's loss. A new referendum in Ireland and Scotland. Make it too complex. Europe makes it impossible. Doing nothing. This is Article 50. We've talked about it before of the European Union agreement has specific rules for how members can voluntarily exit the EU. The UK will lose the membership in both the common union and its custom agreements. A negotiated set of replacement treaties and rules would be postponed, which would require ratification by both the EU and the UK. Key economic aspects is all of the advantage of the EU's treaties covering trade relations amongst members, replaced by less favorable covenants there. Snap election, if they have one of those, there could be other problems. New referendum. The British public has learned much more since the initial vote. About half the Brexit voters that had been now supportive of a second referendum. The course of calls for another vote on Brexit. A stream of drumbeats of media reports revealing how misinformation, outright disinformation, UK voters were subjected to by Robert Mercer, the right-wing billionaire and former giant hedge fund Renaissance Technology, backer of political data from the infamous Cambridge Analytica, wanted to bring the same level of mass disinformation to UK health format in the US, according to The Guardian. Ireland and Scotland, back in 2014, Scottish voters voted against independence from the UK by 55 to 45. The Brexit vote was a shock to the Scots. Further complicating the matters, of reports that Northern Ireland would be granted permission to stay in the single market. Resolving those issues would make it entirely the enterprise largely problematic for England. UP makes more leaving impossible. I don't see any reason why the UK or the EU would do anything other than make this uncomfortable for the Brits. And that is the big one there. Let me just get one other thing before I leave this. Disney's Avengers, pulled in $106 million, the second biggest debut. This is a movie from Disney. The Infinity Wars. That's just an estimate there. The studio emailed out the company's Star Wars films. The Focus Awesome, which drew $119 million. Oh, that was in December of 2015. The Last Jedi, $104 million. Disney updated its opening week of forecasts to $240 million range from the $225 million range, compared with independent forecasts of $230 million there. So these are some films, and also Disney has so far had $1 billion plus generated by the Black Panther. That was from the Marvel superhero library that they also own. I thought we'd just throw that in. Shows a little bit of where the economy is going. Now to the market, various PMI data here. I guess we'll start where we are. This is Nikkei India Service PMI. And we'll just briefly go over this. Business activity rose 50.3 in March. Marginal rise in a new business. Following a modest contraction in February, the Indian service activity stabilized in March, underpinned by great inflows of new work as business sentiment was strong level. Since July, firms raised their staffing levels at a fastest pace since 2011. On the price front, input cost inflation was marked, but softened from February and 3 months. Highest subsequent output weakness in 2018 so far. The seasonally adjusted Nikkei Indian Service Activity Index rose from 48.8 to 50.3. And I'm going to kind of skip over this just a little here. Outstanding business in India's service sector rose in March. Moreover, the rate of acceleration was marked and accelerated to the fastest since last October. Meanwhile, backlog reduced in a manufacturing sector, thereby ending a 21-month period of growth, reflecting an improved demand conditions and pressure on current resources. Service providers expanded their capacity by raising their staffing levels at the quickest pace since 2011. And let's see here. Commenting on this, one of the Dohaya economists there, Indian service activity stabilized at the end of the quarter, underpinning a renewal rise in new work. Anecdotal information highlights an improvement in demand conditions on the price front, despite softening from February. Recent pickup in input inflation in the service station were marked overall. Overall, the decline in activity during February proves to be transitory as India overall economy returns to expansion territory in March. Output growth in manufacturing sector again outperformed the service sector, and has been the case since last autumn. Now let me move on here. This is Kenya's PPI by Stanbic Bank. PCI climbed to a 26-month high there at 50.7. New orders quickened to the fastest pace since 2016. The health of the private sector in Kenya improved to the greatest extent since 2016. During March, the output growth quickened to the fastest pace since the inception of the survey. Now, this survey has only been around since 2014. Meanwhile, the rise in new orders accelerated to the sharpest pace since December of 2016. The highline figure derived from the survey is the Purchase Managers Index, reading of about 50, signaling improvement in business conditions. The main findings of the March survey were the following. The seasonal adjusted PMI rose from 54.7% in February to 55.7% in March. This reflected the sharpest improvement in operating conditions since 2016. Notably, the performance of Q1 2018 was the strongest recorded in 2 years. Central to the upward movement in the headline index was another rise in business activity in March. The rate of expansion accelerated to the sharpest since the series began. Now let me move on down here. The main finding of the survey, I won't go over that again. Central to the upward movement in headline index was another rise in business activity. During March, the rate of expansion accelerated to the sharpest since the series in 2014. In response to output requirements, firms expanded their capacity by raising their staffing levels for the fourth consecutive month. In March, the pace of job growth was solid and the fastest since February. Kenyan firms raised their purchasing activity for the fourth consecutive month. Moreover, the pace of expansion quickened to the sharpest in the survey. Subsequently, pre-production inventories rose to the greatest since 2016. The private sector in Kenya faces higher input costs at the end of the first quarter, despite a softening to the weakness in 2018 so far. The rate of input cost inflation remains sharp and stronger than the series trends. Anecdotal evidence points to a great rise in raw materials costs, with prices for food items, fuel, and transportation reportedly up since February. Meanwhile, staffing costs rose at a modest pace. Output prices increased for the fourth consecutive month, despite easing to the weakness in 2018. So far, the rate of inflation was solid. Firms attributed the higher selling price to pass-through of higher costs burden to clients. So this is Kenya. This is a member of this Stanbic Bank is a member of Standard Bank Group. Now let's pick up some of these others here. Another one, this is out of Ghana. We'll have to move this up a little bit here. But sharp accelerated rise in business activity. Record increase in purchasing activity here. And this is commenting on this. Mr. Mijabi, the economist at Stanbic Bank. The Stanbic Bank Kenyan PMI, continues to signal robust business activity amidst a more stable macro environment, economic environment, as the exchange rates remain supported by a declining currency account deficit, and as declining fiscal deficit and de-inflation process provides positive for both business and consumer confidence. The PMI rose to 55.2 from 54.9 in February, 53.5 in March of 17. The rise in headline PMI readings were mainly driven by sharp rise in input as new orders continue to rise at a decent pace in line with expectations for headline inflation. We expect headline inflation to get to the Bank of Ghana target rate ahead of its schedule. Inflation to moderate its 8% range by the end of Q2 due to stronger than expected de-inflation process over the course of the last 3 months. We expect inflation to print around 8.7% year over year in April, while ending 2018 around 9.3%. The main following of new orders that continue to rise during March. Higher new orders lead to rise in business activity. More rates of expansion quicken there. I have to look at this a little bit closer because a lot of information we don't have. Not sure how we'll handle this. We may, in fact, have a special program. I'm not certain now, from an editorial standpoint, on emerging nations, because, again, to look at Ghana, we need to go a little bit beyond this, particularly de-inflation as it relates there. Rising cost burdens reflect the 9th consecutive month increase in the process charged by Ghanaian companies. That said, the rate of inflation was modest and the slowest since February of last year. This is what we have from Ghana. UK job reports. We have more from the BBC, but the summary of this provides the most comprehensive guide. Growth in permanent placements outstripped that for temporary billings. March signaled a further sharp increase in permanent staff placements in the UK. Demand for staffs rise at a soft pace for the past 15 months. Staffing vacancy contributed to a rise markedly at the end of the first quarter. This was despite growth in downward in demand easing slightly to the lowest for 15 months. This is from Tom Hadley. Permanent placements are growing monthly on month as demand of staffing remains high. Most people are entering employment, more people, but it doesn't make up for the shortfall of candidates for many roles. from a cybersecurity, aerospace, through to sewing machinists and drivers. As a result, employers are increasingly starting to pay drawn candidates away from current job roles into new positions. Growth in pay for temporary roles especially is accelerating in hospitality. Demand for temporary staff is real high, but businesses have fewer applicants from the EU since Brexit. So in other words, they're beginning to see fewer people that are there. Average starting salaries continue to increase sharply in March, despite the rate of inflation softening to a 10-month low. Pay for temporary contract workers rose at the quickest pace since February. Regional variations, upturn in permanent staff placements once again were led by the Midlands, whose rates of growth were marked in all other four regions. On a regional basis, Scotland recorded the sharpest rise in temporary billings at the end of Q1. Growth was also sharp across the Midlands and the south of England, while modest upturns were recorded in the north of England. Staffing vacancies continue to rise at a sharp rate across the public sector compared to the public sector during March. The across the private sector, compared to the public sector. The private sector marked rates of vacancy growth were significant for both permanent and temporary workers. Vacancies for both permanent and short-term staffing across the public sector rose at a steep rate compared to those in February. So that is the UK. We roll along pretty well here. From France, the retail PMI sales unchanged on both monthly and annual basis. Gross margins have fallen at the sharpest pace since 2016. Summary. March saw stagnation in the French retail sector with sales unchanged on a month-on-month basis. Sales were unchanged when compared to 1 year previous. The stagnation fed through to a sharp fall in purchasing activity and further decline in inventory stock. More positive employment continues to rise. Positively, obeyed at a modest pace. Confidence hit a 11-year peak. The seasonally adjusted retail PMI is at 50% in March to signal a stagnation in French retail sales, down from 50.8. This is from Alex Gill. He's an economist at Market. March saw stagnation in the French retail sector, with sales unchanged on a month-to-month basis. The shortfall between actual and expected performance weakened in March, reflecting in part unusually poor climatic conditions. Indeed, optimism with regard to future sales was the strongest in 11 years. That's kind of very unusual here. Actual sales were below previously set plans for 8 consecutive months in March. Moreover, the extent of shortfalls increased from the prior survey. In spite of this, the French retailers maintain optimistic outlook in March. Furthermore, the degree of positive sentiment in regard to the future sales were the strongest in just shy of 11 years. The factors expected to boost sales in the incoming months include continual economic recovery, new product launches, more favorable weather conditions, higher consumer purchasing power. They don't talk about the effects of the tariffs here. Purchasing prices faced by French retail firms increased during March, therefore continuing a trend that has been observed in every month since March of 2014. On we go to China. This is the Caixin General Service PMI there, which covers both manufacturing and the service sector. Total Chinese business activity expanded at the slowest pace for 4 months at the end of the first quarter. Notably, the composite output index fell from 53.3 in February to 50.1 in March. The dip in headline index was driven by increase in output across both manufacturing and service sector during March. Furthermore, rates of growth slipped to a 4-month low in both sectors at 52.3 in March. They were at 54.2 in February. The latest, let me just get this up a little bit here. In line with the trend for activity, manufacturers and service providers both noted a slow upturns in new order volume during March. Rates of growth were identical or modest across both sectors. Service companies generally likened higher sales to new clients, wins, and new offerings, but cite concerns over exchange rate movement and lower tourist numbers. Interesting there. Employment trends deteriorated across both sectors during March. Service companies added to their payroll at a marginal pace that was the weakest in 19 months of expansion. At the same time, jobs shedding intensified both at goods producers, with workforce numbers declining at the fastest rate since last August. Outstanding business increased slightly at service companies, following a broad stagnant backlog over the opening 2 months of the year. Unfinished work increased for the 25th month running at manufacturers, and a stronger rate than in February. And as service companies based in China signal a further increase in input costs during March. That said, the rate of inflation was the slowest recorded in 4 months. Chinese companies continued to increase their selling price in March as part of an attempt to pass on higher cost burden to clients. Chinese business activity growth weakened, and so this is a key point, so we won't go over those. But this is from the Director of Macro Analysis at the CEBM Group. I won't try to pronounce his name here. Zhang. Both new business and employment growth at the slowest rate last month, pointing to cooling demand. However, the ability of service providers to make profits improved as input costs increased at a weaker pace while output costs edged up. The sub-index gauging service companies' expectation towards business activity over the next 12 months declined. Kind of overshot our decline here. To the lowest reading since February, suggesting weakening demand has affected firms' confidence. The Caixin Chinese Composite Index dipped to 51.8 in March, the lowest reading in 4 months, but remains in expansion territory. To slow down output growth in the service sector was faster than in the manufacturing sector. All right, so here we go. This is the U.S. sector PMI. This is basic material production. Showed the fastest expansion since March of 2015. Consumer goods manufacturing signaled the weakest output upturn in 2 years. Technology sector indicated first contraction since 2016. Basic materials sector signaled a quicker output expansion in March, according to the latest PMI sector PMI, afterwards solid output growth in the consumer goods sector, eased since February. The rate of expansion was in fact the weakest since May 2016, following sharp increase in February. The financial sector signaled a softer rate of output growth in March. Although solid overall, it was the second weakest expansion in 11 months. Similarly, healthcare and industrial sector indicated slow output increase, with the former signaling the weakest. Technology sector was the only monitored sector to report a fall in output. The decline was only fractional, but it was the first since February of 2016. I guess that's all, folks. The Nikkei Flash, Japanese manufacturing of PMI, Flash PMI, rose in Japan in April to 53.3 from 53.1. Not a lot of change there. Our output, new orders, and employment increased at a quicker pace. Today, the latest release of the Nikkei Flash Japan Manufacturing Purchasing Manager Index, published on a monthly basis here. The comments from Joe Hayes, and he's an economist. Survey data depicts a positive backdrop in the Japanese manufacturing sector during April. The improvement in the headline PMI was underpinned by strong rates of growth in output of new orders, employment. Furthermore, business confidence strengthened while prices were hiked to a stronger degree, signaling optimism in demand. New exports there, and let's see what. About it. Short and very sweet indeed. Now, this is the market IHS Flash U.S. PMI. Private sector growth rises solidly, underpinned by fastest new order growth since March of 2015. The composite index up at 54.8 from 54.2. The Flash U.S. Service Sector Business Activity Index at 54.4, and the manufacturing at 54.6 up. 56.4. I'll get that right in a minute here. The 54.8 in April was up from 54.2 in March. Indicate a faster upturn in business activity across the private sector since March of 2015. Average cost burdens continue to rise in April with the rate of input price inflation edging up. Average price changes, meanwhile, increased at a pace broadly in line with that seen in March. By one that was weaker than seen for input costs. Now, the manufacturing PMI, the greatest improvement in overall business conditions since September 2014 in April, is highlighted by a seasonally adjusted market flash U.S. manufacturing PMI at 55.6 from 55.6 to 56.5, was boosted by marked expansion output new orders, with the latter growing at the quickest pace in over 3.5 years. A steeper deterioration in vendor performance was also lifted the headline index. Strong growth in new orders drove a solid increase in the level of outstanding business at manufacturers. Robust client demand and signals of sustained pressure on capacity did not, however, lead to improved employment growth. The rate of job creation eased to an 8-month low as firms reportedly push for greater efficiency. Now, this has an impact on employment numbers. Price pressures within the factory sector intensified the rate of input cost inflation, picking up to the fastest pace since June of 2011. Cost increase were partially linked by producers to the introduction of tariffs. This is the first time we've come across even some anecdotal evidence of what's going on. More of our clients demand and higher raw material prices underpin the quickest rise in average selling price in almost 7 years. In line, greater production requirements, firms signal the strongest rise in the purchasing index since September of 2014. Respondents noted that the lengthening delivery time was a key factor leading firms to ramp up their buying activity. Moreover, average supplier performance deteriorated at a joint fastest pace in the series history, February 2004. Longer lead time driven by accelerated growth at both manufacturing and service firms, while the former recorded the steepest rate of expansion. Enjoyed a solid rates of growth. New orders placed with private sector firms rose sharpest in April, showing the biggest gain since March of 2015. The upturn in new business underpins more buoyant output expectations. Moreover, outlook for business activity over the next 12 months rose to its highest level since May of 2015. Moreover, sustained growth in new orders drove the strongest increase in backlog work since 2015, said the pace of job creation softened slightly in 3 months. In line with stronger client demand, rising costs burdens the average price charged for goods and service increase solidly. The rate of input price inflation was the quickest since July of 2013. The composite index is based on the original survey data from ISH Market U.S. Services PMI and the Manufacturing PMI. The seasonally adjusted flash business activity at 54.4 in 4/10 in up from 54 in March. From Dr. Williamson here, the chief economist, the U.S. economy picked up pace again at the start of the Q2, second quarter. The April PMI survey registered the second strongest monthly expansion since October. Manufacturing is leading the upturn, with factories reporting the strongest output gain for 15 months, and the vast service sector is enjoying a steady, robust expansion. After a relatively disappointing start this year, the second quarter should provide a lots more encouraging. The current data points to an amortized GMP rate at 2.5% with scope from some substantial upturn surprises in coming months. Faster growth, new orders accelerated to show the largest surge in demand for goods and services just over 3 years. Second, companies' expectation of growth over the current year jumped to a 3-year high. Third, hiring remains robust as firms struggle to cope with demand. The survey points to non-farm payroll growth at approximately 200,000 in April. The details of this service therefore suggest that output growth is on a course to accelerate as we move up into the summer. Prices, meanwhile, being pushed upwards by strength of the upturn, however, sending hawkish signals of a polished bankers. That basically means the Fed is going to raise their interest rates, according to Dr. Williamson's analysis here, 4 times this year. In other words, instead of, say, 3 times this year. Now, this is interesting. Employment is getting a little bit sluggish. What that means basically is automation itself in many of these industries is now starting to slowly take hold as more and more robotic type operations are introduced and more algorithms are introduced. Now that is one of the things that happens when you have a quote-unquote, using a common term, a juiced economy. This economy has been juiced, but one thing you have to remember, manufacturing, we saw manufacturing strong in the 80s, but it led to instability in a much smaller, not globalized economy. Manufacturing can move things forward, but at the same time, when we speak of manufacturing, we're talking about a lot of smaller manufacturers. In the 80s, it was the beginning of demise of a larger manufacturer, U.S. Steel, GM, etc. But they were much, much larger than today. So although you have manufacturing, most of manufacturing operations employ from 100 to probably about 400 workers at best, most less. And thus you're seeing more and more the bulk of workers in the Facebook type operations, etc., not in manufacturing. Thus, even if you see add-ons to manufacturing, where are the products going? The U.S. economy can only absorb so many. Now, when it starts the tariffs, war, whatever they want to call it, you've already seen a slowdown in China. But that is necessary for the Chinese economy, one, to weed out some of the inflation, and also at the same time speculation. In other words, they need to cool their economy down as they turn more to an internal type economy, and that will adjust their economy. Will show some weakness over the short term, but on the long term they will have a much more stable economy out there. And we looked at some of the European PMIs, France particularly, the economy is still weak in France. We didn't look at Spain this time around, but we did take a look at some of the emerging nations, Ghana, Kenya. We didn't look at South Africa. We'll do them next time. But the situation is the emerging economies, Kenya is doing very well, but they still have 8-9% inflation. For an emerging economy, that is okay. But the problem is they're being squeezed by raw material prices. That can do in many of the emerging economies, because they are the sellers of raw materials to manufacturers, depending on where that particular pricing is. Let me go to the BBC now, and we'll do some of the numbers. They're running a little later, but not too bad. Oops. This is the wrong screen here. We'll eventually get to the right screen. Oh, okay. This is the BBC, the UK economy in weakest growth since 2012. Again, at slowest pace since 2012. GDP growth was at 1/10, down from 4/10 the previous quarter, driven by sharp fall in construction output and sluggish manufacturing sector. This is from the Bureau of National Statistics. We'll look at it in a minute. It's clearly disappointing. That is from the Prime Minister's office. Said the economy has grown every year since 2010. Unemployment is at a 40-year low. But we are not complacent. Well, they put a spin on it here. Sterling fell sharply as changes in interest rates rising receded, falling. The news: the pound was down almost 1.5 cents against the dollar at $1.37, basically speaking. We call it $1.38. Robert Smith, he's head of national accounts, said our initial estimate shows the UK economy growing at the slowest pace in almost 5 years. Not very good news for the UK economy in that they're into Brexit. Snow had a major impact there. John Hawksworth, the chief economist at PwC. There are other preliminary figures. These are only preliminary figures based on largely an estimate rather than actual data for March when the snowstorm. I wasn't aware how bad that snowstorm was. Anyway, construction was the biggest drag on a GDP falling of 3.3% in the first month, while manufacturing growth slowed to 0.2. The government, the Bank of England, this Mr. Carney there, hinted that the interest rate could rise more gradually than expected due to continual uncertainty over Brexit. We talked a little about Brexit. John T. Bloom, the business correspondent, everyone was set to blame the beast from the east, but the blast of snow, etc., etc., slowed down much sharper than thought, but the OSN then very helpfully explained that this is not due to bad weather. The fall in the economic activity was huddled indoors and was mainly replaced by turning up the heat and shopping online. GDP was figures often revised and some bounced back. Well, anyway, I guess they're putting a little spin on it. According to the Chancellor, Philip Harman, the latest data reflects some impact from the weather report. The shadow one, John McDonnell, the Chancellor will want to blame this all on bad weather. And it's not bad weather. They have it. If it caused the problems. And we'll just append the gross domestic product preliminary estimate. This is from the Office of National Statistics. Won't mess around with it. Amazon sales incidentally surged, and of course profits doubled, literally. Reported a 43% surge in revenue from the first quarter, fueled by online shopping in the U.S. So they are up. A big fight between DJ Trump and the Amazon Corporation. And the company recently been targeted. The postal rates. Well, that will be solved. Amazon reported sales from its North American business rose $30.7 billion compared to $20.9 billion in Q1 of last year. So they're up $10 billion. The Amazon Web Services, which hosts the cloud platforms used by major companies, also performed well in the quarter. However, international business, while sales rose to $14.8 billion, its loss expanded to $622 million there. Oops. Let me move along here and do the data, as they say. They've changed things around, so I think what we'll do is the FTSE. We'll do the FTSE 100 at 80.78. In Amsterdam, they were at plus 3.5. In France, they were at 29.61. The DAX in Germany at 80.40. In Madrid, they were at 23.110. And we'll do the Asian markets first. In Bombay at 256.10. Hang Seng in Hong Kong at 272.99. And the Nikkei at 148.26. And I guess we have to go back and do the Dow. The Dow was down negative 11.51. The Nasdaq closed at 1.12. The Merck, I think. No, this is S&P 5. I don't know if we have the Merck anymore. Anyway, at 2.97. and we have a little commodities. We don't have very much in commodities. I'll have to go to a different chart, but Brent crude was at, we don't even have the spot anymore, at 74.64. West Texas crude at 68.10, $68.10. T-Boone Pickens jumped for joy. He remembers, although we're doing something new here, at $15 barrel oil. The Forex at gold is at $1,321.90. Don't have Dubai anymore. Sorry about that. So we're going to really have to get together our own independent table here to push this all. Anyway, nonetheless, GDP for Q1 doesn't look too bad, but we'll continue to look at inflation and also employment numbers. Will they get to be better? It's interesting. In Q2, employment sometimes rises in the summer months traditionally. Holidays, etc., used to be plant equipping the plants and all that sort of stuff. You have some slowdown June, July, and August. Then we come back in September. But all of these things have sort of been upended. Back to school buying. We don't have the big box retailers around. I mean, some of them around, but very, very few. It's online. So, in other words, things have been thrown sort of out there. And we'll be looking at the redundancies of people being unemployed in very small numbers and see how that works out, and where food cost is, and where also Brent crude, gasoline, we didn't look at it today, but it is rising slightly at the pump, and we're in April. We've not gotten into May. Now, if this goes up for the summer driving season, we'll see what happens with consumers and discretionary spending. And we didn't look at consumer confidence. We'll get that next week. But again, a savings rate is positive. It's up. So what it basically means if consumers that are getting the quote-unquote tax cut are saving it. Basically what the corporations did. You remember when the corporations got it, they said, well, we're going to improve our workers, these salaries, wages, etc. Walmart did. They raised it by $1. And at the same time, many of the corporations bought back their own stock. In other words, there was a limit to what they would do. And some of them gave bonuses out, but that was on the front side. Those bonuses have already went out. They went out in January. Now we are past April 15th. Tax refunds are moving a little bit slower this year, and that will go through the system by June, mostly probably by the middle of May. That will be through the system, and we'll see what consumers are doing with the extra money. But if it goes in the tank, so to speak, a lot of it goes in the tank, then consumers will not be buying a lot for the summer. And as far as summer clothing, that's out with a long winter here in most of America. Now it is moderating. So we'll be looking at a number of things. We have a program called All About Sports where we look at the economics of sports and all the new offerings out there, including the Twitters and Facebooks having both NFL and Major League Baseball games, and how that all accounts for the discretionary income, what restaurants, bars, etc., where they go. A lot of people are involved in that particular part of the service sector. And then, of course, where technologies go. Some of the technology companies are laying off, where they are hiring, etc. Those are some of the things that now blend into this thing we call macroeconomics, where we not only look at what the Fed, the central banks, are doing, but we also look at what the markets are doing, because increasingly in modern industrial capitalist society, stock markets play a more significant role. And in it, we're starting to factor in tariffs. That's something we haven't done in a very, very long time, and you'll see that affecting Germany particularly. And we'll see how it works out in France and in Spain. We'll bring those in to the next report, but I'll put at least one or two of these PMIs up and in the UK with basics, because effectively one of the major U.S. trading partners, the UK, will, as they say, be in a holding pattern as this basic thing unfolds in the UK. And the UK was already a weak economy, which it has shown. So we'll see where the largest economy in the EU goes, Germany. But France is fairly marginal. So in other words, you have these marginal economies there. And the last time we looked at Spain, Spain was in pretty good shape. Let's see, since we have on these channels here, we can quickly look at Spain. We have the manufacturing PMI. Make sure we don't get the Espanol one. Strong increases in new business is the headline here. Output growth at 7-month low, leading to near record rise in a backlog. The Spanish manufacturers recorded a further marked improvement in business conditions at the end of Q1, although the rate of output growth slowed from February. It remained marked and another sharp increase in new orders, easing the rate of expansion, contributing to the strongest rise in back orders. So let's get to the summary here. The comment here is by Hacker. While the growth of the Spanish manufacturing sector eased in March, the first quarter as a whole was still successful start of the year. The slowdown in rise of output growth led to one of the strongest increases in outstanding business ever recorded. So they do, in fact, have it going there. The PMI was at 54.8 in March, down from 56. So they were in good shape. I thought they were there. That's the Spanish economy. So the EU is not doing badly. The emerging markets, we looked at Kenya, we looked at Ghana. They're in actually a pretty good shape. But how these tariffs will increase their costs will be a very interesting sector. This will do it for us, those in business next week. A productive one for the consumer. Obviously, you're keeping your eyes on your savings account, which is a good thing. Savings is a very strong point in a nation, particularly one that's running $1.5 trillion deficits. Not a very good thing. We'll be looking at healthcare costs and many other things here. Good day. From WBRN Radio and on the Bostonred Network, we are starting to consolidate things here, incidentally, to make it easier for you to find us.